You're watching the Rails 3 screencast. I'm Greg Pollock, and in this episode, we're going to be creating a new Rails application and looking at the new routing syntax. So to create a new Rails application, we're simply going to run our Rails command from the command line as you're used to. Except this time there's a few new options. So if we run it, we're going to see now that we can specify the Ruby path, a database we want to use, or a template for our application. We've seen these before. Here comes the new options. We can specify dev if we have a local Rails checkout we want to run our Rails application against. We can specify edge if we want to run our application against edge Rails. We can also tell it to skip the gem file if we don't want to use bundler. We can tell it to skip active record if we want to use a different ORM, such as data mapper, or maybe we don't even want to use a database at all. We can tell it to skip test unit if we want to use a different test framework like RSpec or otherwise. We're also given the option to skip prototype. Now this is referring to the prototype JavaScript framework. Rails 3 is more JavaScript agnostic than ever before, meaning that it's really easy to say skip prototype and maybe plug in jQuery or MooTools. There's also an option to skip Git. Now, when I initially saw this, I was like, wait a second, Rails is doing something with Git? Well, it turns out that Rails by default is going to give you a .gitignore file with a couple intelligent defaults which you can use for your Git repository. But if you don't want it, you can skip it. Now let's go ahead and jump in and create our first Rails 3 application. Our application is going to be called test app. We're going to go into the application directory, and if we look inside the script directory here, we're going to find that there's only one file, which is called Rails. We don't have any of those script files we did previously. If we run Rails from inside of our application directory, it's going to call this Rails executable. It's then going to give us the parameters we can send into this command. If we run Rails generate, we're going to be able to generate, say, a scaffold or a controller. We can also do Rails G as a shortcut you see here. We can do Rails space console to get the console, or just Rails C, Rails server to get your server, or just Rails S. We can also do Rails DB console, or the shortcut there, Rails DB. And of course, you can get all of the old script commands which you've used previously in Rails 2. To summarize the most important commands, script generate is now Rails G, script console is now Rails C, script server is now Rails S, and script DB console, Rails DB. Now, one of the things I realized as we started using these commands is that if I added an alias to my bash profile of R to Rails, they became that much simpler. Now, if we take a look back at a Rails 2 application inside the config environment.rb, we would have our initializers. This is where we set global configuration options, stuff like load paths, stuff like dependency management and configuring the gems that we're using, the plugins that we're using, maybe the time zone, and any other global configuration options. The first big change about this file in Rails 3 is that all of our dependency management, all of our gems, are now going to be listed in our gem file. And this, of course, is taken care of by bundler. The second big change is that all of our configuration options are now going to be moved to the application.rb file. They're also going to be wrapped inside of an application class, which is wrapped in a test app module. Test app, if you remember, that is our name of our application. So now all of our configuration options are sort of wrapped inside of an application object inside of our application. It's also worth mentioning that this application class is a valid rack app. This is the first place you're going to see in Rails 3 where it's become even more rack compatible. Now it's time to talk about the new router API inside Rails 3. But first of all, let's take a look back at the old action controller stack. There's a lot of stuff in there. And in Rails 3, this has been refactored in several different ways, starting with the creation of the action dispatch component. The action dispatch component takes care of any libraries having to do with HTTP dispatching, Rails middleware, or Rails routing. Now, if we take a look at the Rails source, if we look inside the action pack folder, we're going to see an action dispatch folder. And inside there, there's folders for each of these inner components, HTTP, middleware, and routing. And inside those, we're going to find all the libraries for each of those components. Just like in Rails 2, in Rails 3, we put all of our routes in our routes.rb file. You might notice, though, there's a slight difference at the top of the file. Our routes are contained within our test app application class. In Rails 3, most of your old routing syntax will work, so you may not have to make any changes. But if you want to start creating a new app, you might want to take advantage of the new syntax, starting with the ability to drop the block parameter. So we no longer need to say map.resources. Taking that a step further, where in Rails 2 you needed to have map dot and post dot, in Rails 3 we can get rid of those, which gives us a little bit nicer of a syntax. In Rails 2, when we wanted to specify alternate RESTful actions, we would use the member and the collection options. In Rails 3 we also use these, but we're given a new block syntax, so we can wrap the post inside member or a collection block. We can also list these by saying post preview on member or get archived on collection. All these syntaxes are valid and still work in Rails 3. In Rails 2, when we wanted to specify a custom path, we would do map connect login, maybe point that at the session controller, the new action. In Rails 3, the syntax is improved. Now we can just do match login session new. Now that string at the end there that says session pound new, what's happening there is all it's doing is it's taking that string, splitting on the pound, and assuming that session is the controller and new is the action. To do a named route, where say we want to be able to specify login path inside of our views, in Rails 2 we would do map.login. So the .login is where we're specifying the path. And in Rails 3 we would just do match login session new as login. To have a root path in Rails 2, we might do map root controller users action index. This is shortened a little bit in Rails 3. We can now do root to users index. So again, we're using that string to specify the controller and the action. To do legacy routes, in Rails 2, by default, you would get this at the bottom of all of your routes.rb files. In Rails 3, that's been commented out by default, and it's also using optional parameters here. So we can specify just the controller and the action, the controller action ID, or even the format at the very end. Let's talk a little bit more about parameters. If I had a blog and I wanted people to access articles by going to articles, year, month, day, here's what I would do in Rails 2. In Rails 3, the syntax for parameters is very similar, except here, of course, we're using the new syntax to specify the controller and the action. But what if we wanted the user to optionally be able to specify articles year, or articles years month, or articles years day? In Rails 2, we'd have to specify that in 3 different routes. Whereas with Rails 3, we can use optional parameters, put the parentheses in the right place, and this way we can have each of those different routing options. In Rails 2, if we want to specify what method a route should use, we can simply do conditions method get. In Rails 3, we have 2 different options to do this. We can do via get. We can also do get articles year post index. Definitely a nicer syntax. Something completely new to Rails 3, we can now do redirection right there in our routes file. So if we want the sign-in path to redirect to login, we can simply do this. If we want to be able to have parameters inside of our redirects, we can do that as well. In this case, redirecting users/name to just /name. We can also redirect to external links if we want to do that. In Rails 3, we also have a new syntax for dealing with constraints. Whereas with Rails 2, if we wanted to specify that the year parameter needed to be 4 digits, we would use the requirements keyword. Whereas in Rails 3, we use the constraints option and specify sort of the same sort of regex. The constraints option is even more powerful in Rails 3. We can specify a lot of different things that have to deal with a request, starting with, let's say, the user agent. So if I wanted to specify a path that's only valid for people using iPhones, well, I could do user agent iPhone. I could also specify a path that's only available to people with certain IP address, or even under a certain host, or even subdomain. I could also create a library, a separate library altogether, that does IP restriction, and that would make sure that only people with certain IP addresses could get into the routes which I list in that code block. As we mentioned earlier, Rails 3 is even more RAT compliant, and we can see that down at the router level, because here's the most basic route you could possibly do. All this is doing is sending in the status code, the headers, and the body. So that's all you need with a rack request, and that's compatible with the Rails3 router. Also worth mentioning is that each of your actions inside your controller is its own rack endpoint. What this means is that if you wanted to, you could have middleware sitting in front of any of your actions since they're valid rack endpoints. Lastly, we can also build custom rack applications for certain routes. Maybe you don't want to go straight to Rails, build your own custom rack app and go straight to that for speed. For more information about the new Rails3 routing syntax, I highly recommend you check out the Rails guide on the topic.